picture here, and I'm going to ask, does anybody know who this is? This is Eric Liddell. That's how I say it. I'm not sure. Most people know him from the 1924 Olympics. He's a Scottish runner, and he chose not to run the 100-meter, which he was likely to win. He was favored to win, but he chose not to run because it fell on the Lord's Day, on a Sunday. But he chose to run the 400-meter race because it fell during the middle of the week. I was thinking, man, he would have loved Chick-fil-A. That's what came to my mind when I was working on this sermon. It says something about where I'm at. But he did run the 400-meter, and he won. And when asked what his success in running the 4-meter was, he said, "The secret of my success in the 400-meter is that I run the first 200 as hard as I can, and then for the second 200, with God's help, I run harder." And when the Edinburgh Evening News wrote concerning his victory in Paris, they said it was the last 500 meters that meant the making or breaking of Liddell. Running the Christian race sometimes is hard, period. Running harder the second, I just turned 56 a couple weeks ago. So maybe that's why I went this direction as I was studying this. But running harder the second half of the life or the journey, Daniel had me take pause and look at his life and look at my life and see where we're at. And I don't know where you're at in your journey. You might have not decided to step into walking with God yet. Maybe you're kind of poking at it and considering the cost and seeing how hard it is to run sometimes and wondering if that's even what you want. Maybe you're new to this faith journey and you're loving it. I mean, you're running and you're looking at the trees and you're like, this is great. I love God. I love Jesus. He loves me. Maybe you're in a hard place right now, a hard season, and you've had, again, this is me, but one thing, Mario Kart is something I've always done with my kids over the years. It's one of the few games I'm actually okay at when we play video games. But when you're driving the car and you get to throw the bananas back and you make the other cars slip, or the atomic bomb or the oil slick, that was always. And sometimes life feels like that, like it's throwing that kind of stuff at me, trying to either sideswipe me from the race, trying to trip me up, trying to get me to fall. And we've all had those experiences and journeys. And so as I was studying this, I just, I stepped back and I looked at Daniel as a person. And I just thought, sometimes we read the Bible and we know these people lived and stuff. I'm like, this was a real guy living a real life. And I'm just in awe of Daniel. And I know we're not supposed to, put too much stock in man and idolize. But, have you ever met somebody who just has certain characteristics? And when you meet with that person, you're like, man, I want to be more like that. Joanna and I went for a walk last night, and there's this couple, probably about 20 years or so beyond our years, and they're walking through our neighborhood holding hands, and I've seen them a number of times. Usually, this was night, so I couldn't see what they were doing, but a lot of times they're laughing and talking, and you just have that thought, man, I hope, 20 years from now, Joanna and I are, still at that place in our relationship, and my daughter, my oldest daughter, in spite of me my whole life trying to teach her that the glass is half empty, she has a glass half full mentality. And I'm just like, man, I tried really hard. But she is the most positive person. And even when life throws hard things at her, she's just rolls with things and laughs and has this great attitude. Or my oldest son, he is probably the kindest person I know. In all honesty, I've never heard him say a bad word about anybody. I admire that, and I think, man, didn't get that from me. We had a men's night last Monday, and I was sharing this with our discussion group. When I was in my early 30s, kind of just building my career, there was a businessman that I was kind of in awe that I got to even rub shoulders with, because he was very successful businessman, amazing Christian man, great family man, all these things, and I just was amazed that in my early 30s, this young guy, that I got to learn from this guy, and yet he always, whenever we got together, he was always asking me questions about my faith or about God, and he was always asking me questions about business, and he was always interested in me, and I thought, what do you have to learn from me, But just through that, I just remember walking away going, okay, I want to be like that. I want to be a humble, teachable person when I'm, his age, and somebody my age at that time comes in. And so there's these qualities that you see in people and you admire. And Daniel is one of those where I'm like, this guy is amazing. Because as you read through the book of Daniel, it kind of happens fast, and you think you're just reading, a snippet here and there. This is usually what we think of when we see, when we think of Daniel. If you can bring up that picture, at least this is what I usually would think of. Like Daniel's just a little kid, like David and fighting Goliath or something. But what we don't stop and realize sometimes, or at least I don't often, is that Daniel is probably in his early 80s by the time we get to chapter 6. So they need to put a little more gray hair on him for us older folks, when they talk about it with the kids. But he has served faithfully for almost 70 years in a secular culture, a culture completely separate from his, alongside a pagan king, many pagan kings actually, and Daniel is still serving his God faithfully. And I just think that is absolutely amazing. I love, as I look at his life and what he has done, when we look at chapter 1, when we open Daniel, he was just a kid, brought into exile, pulled away from his family and his people to come live with the king. And the king is basically making him an apprentice and indoctrinating him changes his name, changes his education, changes his culture. And in all of that, Daniel stays faithful to his God. And I just think, how does Daniel do that? How does Daniel stay faithful to the Lord, whether he's serving the king in a palace or, like we find later at the end of chapter 6, facing lions in a lion's den? So whether he's in the palace or the den, he's trusting and serving God. And I think there's a lot we have to learn as we look at Daniel's life, how he kept running the race and kept persevering even amidst all these challenges. And I think as I look at Daniel's life, there were 3 things that I pulled out. 3 very simple things, not easy things, but simple things on why Daniel was able to stay faithful to God even in the midst of living in a foreign culture, in a foreign land, and even facing hard times. And the first of those is that Daniel knew God. So if you go chapter 6 and you look at Daniel's life, it seems simple, but Daniel knew who God was. And when we get to chapter 6, what we find is that we're on our third king. And as Clarence mentioned last week, we were in the Babylonian period, and now we're moving into the Medo-Persian rule. So it's a completely different kingship, which, by the way, I don't know if others knew, but Daniel knew this was coming because he interpreted the dreams for the previous kings, that this was going to take place. So now we're moving into a totally new reign in the Medes and Persians. And as the king comes on, he is establishing his kingdom. So he is setting up 120 different satraps, or what he calls them, but they're basically leaders over different parts of his kingdom. And then, in addition to that, he's setting up 3 administrators to be over those 120 satraps or leaders. And Daniel is one of those people. But the king has his eye on Daniel too, because he wants to make Daniel the number 1 of those 3 administrators. And so as he's setting up his kingdom, as you can imagine, just typical to like our own political system, once somebody is coming up in the ranks, there's always people that would rather have the king's eye and want to bring Daniel down. And so many of these satraps get together, and they want to start a smear campaign of Daniel, so he is not the lead guy with the king. And so as they kind of go through and try to put together their case as to why Daniel should not be in the lead position next to the king. And surprisingly, as we learn in verse 4, towards the tail end of verse 4, it says, they could find no corruption in him, because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt or negligent. Which is absolutely amazing. Almost 70 years of serving in a worldly political system, and they could not find anything. And not just corrupt, but negligence. Like they couldn't find any, like surely this guy sent out an email on, the company's email, the corporate email that just wasn't, something. They got to be able to find something, not even any negligence. He served faithfully. And it goes on to say that we will never find any basis for charge against this man, Daniel, unless it is something to do with the law of his God. And as I think of running my race, and I think of this second half where I want to run stronger with God's help, may it be said of me that the only thing people could stack up against me and my character was the Word of God. And so Daniel knew the Lord so closely. Can you imagine knowing God so intimately and so closely and walking so faithfully and obediently with him that the only thing people can charge against you is your commitment to God and his Word. But with this, the satraps went to the king, and they propose that he send out an edict that nobody can pray to any person or any god other than King Darius for 30 days. And Darius thinks this is a good idea. And remember, he's trying to pull together 2 kingdoms, right? So he's trying to, the Babylonian kingdom is going by the wayside, but he's trying to pull these people, the Medes and the Persians, his people, with these people, and combine a kingdom. And so, sure, it makes sense. This would be a great way to kind of do that and put everybody at the focal point, that King Darius is in charge now, and we have a new kingdom. But the fact that they made it 30 days says something to me about Daniel, and it says something to me about these guys. Like, they didn't want to lock themselves in for too long, right? Because they may have to come up with a different strategy or a different plan if this doesn't work. So let's just make it 30 days. For 30 days, you know, you can have, we can worship you and only you. But it also says something about Daniel, because they knew there was no way he was going to go 30 days without calling on his God. And so the king makes this edict and this plan. And what's the first thing we find Daniel doing in verse 10 after this proclamation? And of course, what they want to do is let's make this 30 days. And as most of us know, if you've been in church a little bit, what happens? If anybody worships another god, is that on? They'll be thrown into the lion's den. And so in verse 10, what we have Daniel doing is, it says, "Now then Daniel, learning of the decree, that the decree had been published, went home to his upstairs room with the windows open towards Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and he prayed, giving thanks to God just as he had done before." 3 times a day. So the first thing he does is he goes to God in prayer. And I find it interesting, 2 things that stood out to me in this. I feel like if I knew that if I chose to be faithful to God, well, first of all, I'd probably have some mental gymnastics. Like, I mean, God's everywhere. He's omniscient. He's omnipresent. I can pray to him in my heart. You know, that's 30 days. So I'd probably be trying to think, like, is there ways that, you know, I can still honor God, but, you know, not risk my life doing it? And then I'd probably be thinking, like, my prayer would probably be something more like, "Dear God, I don't want to die." Maybe. It'd be a little bit more desperate. And I'm not saying he didn't have moments of desperate prayer where he was crying out to God, but I just find it interesting that he starts out giving thanks. That's his first thought. He kneels down and prayed, giving thanks to God. And my other thought was, just as he had done before. I've had periods in my life where I've gone to God more than usual in my life journey and in my race, but usually it's at those crisis moments. Like, I probably prayed 3 or 6 or 10 times a day, but it's in the crisis moments. It says he'd been doing this every day. This is his normal practice, to pray 3 times a day. And so I realize when I look at Daniel and his desire to know God and intimately be close to God, and I think all my excuses kind of fall to the wayside, you know, in terms of, man, you know, I know I haven't had time to pray or have quiet time the last 3 days, but it's been a really busy week. I'm thinking Daniel was pretty busy. I mean, he was in the top leadership of the kingdom. And I'm thinking that maybe he didn't have time too. You know, I just read recently, and I know not to have it always go there, but I read recently that the average American spends 3 hours a day on social media and 7 hours a day on a screen. That's 2 hours, almost 2 hours a week that we're spending on screens. And I was thinking, okay, I don't think I'm there. I don't know. Am I, Joanna? I don't think I'm there. But even if I was a good Christian and say I spent half that time on screens, or even a third or a quarter of time, I mean, that's 12 hours, 24 hours a week. I don't know, maybe knowing God and being close to God, maybe there's a correlation there. I don't know. I think we underestimate sometimes the power of prayer in our lives. And I don't mean that, like, we know that prayer is powerful. We know that in those crisis moments that God hears us and he is there for us, and we know that God can answer prayers, and he does answer prayers, and he's faithful in that. But I'm talking just in terms of prayer to really know God, to grow in our understanding of who God is. I've been reading, or I should say listening to, a fascinating book by Andrew Klavan titled The Great Good Thing: A Secular Jew Comes to Faith in Christ. And as he was talking about his conversion in this book, he said something that fascinated me. He said, when referring to kind of his conversion journey, he said, over the course of the next 5 years, through prayer, and almost entirely through prayer, my life was transformed. It was interesting. He read a novel, not a Christian novel, it was a secular novel. But in this novel, the character every night would pray, interesting enough, a Thanksgiving prayer, just a short little prayer. And Andrew decided to start doing that. A secular Jew started praying, and through just this short little prayer and growing in that, God started speaking to him. And he started knowing God and moved to a point where in his 50s, he trusted Christ, even got baptized in his late or mid-50s, I think around my age. And I just thought that is so fascinating. Like how much, like I love prayer and I believe in the power of prayer, but how much more might I know God like Daniel did? I mean, both the satraps that were trying to trap him and Daniel himself, like they knew he wasn't going to go without praying in those 30 days. But why would Daniel go without praying in those 30 days? God was his everything. Why would he go 30 minutes? God was the one who told him what was going to happen to King Nebuchadnezzar. God was the one that told him what was going to happen to Belshazzar. Thank you. Yeah, I didn't study chapter 2 that much, or 5. So, you know, God was the one that walked him through every step of the way and brought him to victory in every step of the way. And why would he stop communicating with God? That was his source of power. That was his source of everything. So I just want to read you a few verses, and this is where Daniel's communicating with God and God's communicating with Daniel. Daniel 1:8. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with king's food or with the wine that he drank. This is another thing. Through prayer, how did Daniel have the wisdom to know that, sure, king, you can change my name. Sure, king, you can change my education. Sure, king, you can teach me new languages. And then draw the line in the sand and say, nope, I'm not going to do that. Only the wisdom of God could give him that. Daniel 2:17 and 19. Then Daniel went to his house and made the matter known to his companions and told them to seek mercy from God of heaven concerning this mystery. And this is when he was working to interpret, or praying to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dreams. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. Daniel answered, no wise man can show the king this mystery. But there is a God in heaven who reveals these mysteries. Daniel sought God first. Daniel knew God, and Daniel knew God was his only source for these answers. Daniel 2:20. Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belongs wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. Daniel knew that all authority and wisdom came from God, not human power. Daniel 9. So we haven't studied this one yet. Clarence is sick. I'm trying to help him with his next sermon. Then I turned my face to the Lord God, seeking him by prayer and plea for mercy with fasting and sackcloth and ashes. I prayed to the Lord my God and made confessions. O my God, incline your ear to hear, for we do not present our pleas before you because of our righteousness, but because of your great mercy. Why would Daniel stop praying? This was his source for everything. But Daniel not only knew God, even more importantly, God knew Daniel. James 4:8 says, "Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you." Hebrews 4:16 says, "Let us then, with confidence, draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in times of need." We know God because God first knew us. And the reason why Daniel went to God with everything was because God met Daniel in his every need. Whether he was serving, needed wisdom to serve in the palace alongside a pagan king, or whether he needed God's help in the midst of a decree, or like we find at the end, that he actually is thrown into the pit. Here are some things that God spoke to Daniel. This is Daniel 1:9-17. "And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams." From the beginning, God spoke to Daniel because he knew Daniel. He knew Daniel's heart. Daniel 2:47. "The king answered Daniel, 'Truly your God is God of gods and Lord of kings, and a reverer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery. God works through Daniel, so his own power and wisdom would be made known to the nations.'" Daniel 6:22. "My God sent his angels and shut the lion's mouth, and they have not harmed me, because I was found blameless before him." Daniel 9:22-23, helping Clarence with his next sermon again. "He made me understand, speaking with me and saying, 'O Daniel, I have now come out to give you insight and understanding. For you,'" I love this, "'for you are greatly loved.'" Isn't that amazing? You are greatly loved. These are the words of God to Daniel and the words of God to us. Daniel 10. "And he said to me, 'O Daniel, man greatly loved, understand the words that I speak to you. Fear not. Peace be with you. Be strong and of good courage.'" Daniel's relationship with God was personal. He sought God, and God met him every step of the way. So, first, Daniel knew God. God knew Daniel. And last, I think the reason why Daniel was able to be a faithful perseverer in his faith is because Daniel knew his life was in God's hands. Every step of the way. And I again, when I was putting this together and just stepping back and thinking of Daniel as a person, as a kid, in his early teens, being put in this situation where he literally, they're trying to wipe his identity from him. And to make that resolve, at some point he had to say, I know God is who he said he is. Because there's a difference between knowing about God and knowing God. And Daniel knew the character of God. And he saw it over and over again. Daniel is a testament looking back 80 years. I can be a testament looking back 56 years that just like David said in his 70s at the end of his life, I never was begging for bread. God was always there. God was always faithful. And Daniel is a great cloud of witness for us. But Daniel drew a line in the sand, and he said, I know God's character. He didn't, when he stepped into this and God gave him these dreams, he didn't know how the kings were going to respond. I mean, he was given some pretty damning news to these kings. But over and over again, who's still standing? Daniel's still there. So it's interesting. The Daniel's name means God my judge, or God is my judge. And it appears that that's the way Daniel lived his life. He wasn't trying to please man. He wasn't trying to please the king. He wasn't trying to please those under him to make sure. And I think it's a strong message for us. I mean, we have such a politically charged climate. And I think it's a warning to us to remember where we put our hope and where we put our faith and where we put our assurance. Because we don't know from day to day what's going to happen, but we do know how things end. And so I would say, and I realize we have a different political system, right? We have freedom to vote. We have freedom of speech, and we should stand with our convictions. This isn't choosing a side, but where God has convicted us. But what this convicted me at, I better be really prayed up and have a heart like Daniel towards praying before I decide I'm going to jump into a conversation that might be politically charged, even though a lot of politically charged things are related to our faith and our convictions, right? But I better be prayed up before I decide to make a post, or before I decide to get into a conversation, because I think I want to be faithful to God and remember, just as we hear in this, God raises up kings, God brings down kings. Can I pray faithfully for our leaders? And like Daniel, even if I had to serve alongside them, can I faithfully serve God and faithfully serve the king? I love what Daniel says. So he goes into the lion's den. I don't think there's any spoilers here. He goes into the lion's den. What's interesting about, again, how Daniel, his life is in God's hands. When you read through this, everybody's anxiously trying to control the situation. There's nothing about Daniel's anxiety. There's nothing about his stress in here. We have him praying. Then we have the king realizing that he loves Daniel. He wants Daniel to lead with him. And he just put Daniel in a really bad situation. So he's running around. He's not sleeping. He's not eating. We've got the satraps running around trying to manipulate and control. And here Daniel is faithfully putting his trust in the only one that can shut the lion's mouth. And the only one that he's seen over and over again deliver. And that takes an assurance that his life is completely in God's hand. Whether he's 14 or 80, whether he's in a palace or a prison, he's going to serve God. But he comes out of that. The king rushes to the pit to see if Daniel's God was faithful to deliver him. And he says, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue from the lion? And Daniel answered, this amazes me, may the king live forever. I'd be like, you darn right he did, king. It's my God. And he says, may the king live forever. My God sent his angel, and he shut the mouth of the lion. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight. And so what do we have again? Because of Daniel's faithfulness, because of his trust, because he knew God knew him and loved him, and he had put his life in God's hands, we have another king, secular king, pagan king, giving worship to Daniel's God. I issue a decree, this is from the king, that in every part of my kingdom people must fear and revere the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, and he endures forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed. His dominion will never end. He rescues and saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. For all the world to hear and see that our God is the one true God. But it took Daniel trusting and believing faithfully for those opportunities for the world to praise our God. In this book I was reading, another thing that Andrew Klavan said that hit me is, he said, God is not susceptible to proof and disproofs. If you believe, the evidence is all around you. If you don't believe, no evidence can be enough. Faith in God is not a lack of evidence. There's evidence everywhere, but faith allows you to see what's happening outside of the physical. And what Daniel was able to do is keep trusting God even before Nebuchadnezzar was humbled. You know, every step of the way, he was able to trust God because he knew the outcome. And God proved faithful over and over again. And, you know, we all have those trials that trip us up and keep us from running. And it's hard. This day and age, it seems like a lot of people have stopped running the race. But we can trust fully. And we have to remember that every one of us, Daniel faced the sting of death, like all of us will. He came to the end of his life. But we can put our hope and our faith and our trust for those of us, you know, I think Daniel, you look at different Old Testament people, and there's different ways that, you know, Moses, we say, was kind of a figure of Christ, and Joshua, Joseph, you know, these different. And I think Daniel's probably one of the most Christ-like figures we have, because, I mean, I know Daniel wasn't perfect. This isn't about a perfect man. This is about a man who walked faithfully with a perfect God who met him in every one of his needs. So this isn't, I'm not trying to say Daniel's perfect, but the Bible does not sugarcoat things. It doesn't, you know, I mean, we see David's failure. I mean, we see the falling of many Christian people who got sidetracked, that got tempted, who fell away from the race they were running, or at least fell down and had to get back up. God had to meet them in that, and God did meet them in that. So I'm like, there's nothing. I look through these, I'm like, where's the kink in Daniel's armor? You know? And I know he wasn't perfect, but also I see a man who walked faithfully through his whole life. And so I think these principles of him knowing God and God knowing him and him giving his life completely to whatever God had for him stood strong. And the reality is that Christ did live a perfect life. Christ did go into the pit for us, and he felt the sting of death, but he rose again. And when we put our faith and trust in him, we can literally face that then too. Where, O death, is your sting? Where is your victory? It's been swallowed up, not by a lion, but by Christ's death and resurrection and the new life we can have in him. So he is faithful, and I don't know where you're at in your race right now. We are here for you. If you're having trouble, if you're at a point, we've all been at a point where we are knocked down, distracted, tempted, taken away from the race. So if you're there today, then we're here for you. You're not running alone. Don't run alone. But God is faithful, and he will be faithful to the end. And I think if anybody, whatever point you're at in your faith journey, 56, 70, there's people in this room that can look back and attest that, man, I didn't see God. I didn't know where God was at that point, and I almost lost it because I didn't think he was going to show up, but he showed up again and again. And so let's continue to put our life in the hands of a faithful God who loves us and wants to know us and has given us complete access through prayer, through Jesus, through the Holy Spirit. It's easy to think, well, Daniel's, he's a bio. God gave him some special. We have the same Spirit. We have the same God. And, in James, I'll end with this, but in James, at the end, James says, the prayers of a righteous man is powerful and effective. And then he talks about Elijah. Now, I would not compare my prayer life to Elijah. I would not think that I have anything on Elijah. But it says, Elijah was a human being, even as we are. He prayed earnestly that it would not rain, and it didn't rain in the land for 3.5 years. Again he prayed, and the heavens gave rain, and the earth produced its crops. It's not about Daniel. It's not about the faithfulness of Daniel. It's about the faithfulness of our God. And we have the Holy Spirit. In fact, we have more revelation than Daniel does. We know Christ came. We have the whole scriptures. So let's continue to put our life in